Good morning, everyone. We would like to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today. My name is Naeem, and I'll be your host for today's session. We have the pleasure of presenting today's topic once again, which is Modern Service Management Operating Models 2022. Just to reiterate, this webinar is for C-level IT executives and senior managers responsible for service management as well as service delivery management. This will be a 45-minute session, and a recording of the webinar will be available afterwards as well. Unfortunately, due to a large audience, there will be no Q&A and in-webinar chat for this particular webinar. However, if you do have any questions, we'll provide contact details at the end of the session so you can send them over to us. So I just want to give everyone an introduction to who we are. We also have the ICOR webinar team. So literally we have Chris, who has worked in IT service management for the last 35 years. He has held senior positions at major blue chip companies and is a keen enthusiast for new technologies and ways of working. We also have Andy, who has worked within IT for 25 years. He has previously been a CTO, as well as holding various senior IT service management positions, both within public and private sectors across a broad range of industry sectors. He's passionate about the value that service management can bring to the organizations. So now that you understood a bit about the ICOR team here, I would like to give an introduction about ICOR itself. We are 25 years old. We are the UK's largest privately owned IT service delivery management transformation consultancy. We also enable companies to be effective through modern approaches to IT service management and end-to-end service delivery best practice. We also work across multiple sectors addressing multiple challenges. Now that you have understood a bit more about ICOR, I will now be handing over to Andy to get us underway today.
Thanks very much, Naeem. And first, I'd just like to thank everyone who's on the webinar for taking time out of your no doubt busy schedules to attend. And hopefully we can provide you with some useful insight and information to take back into your organisations. So I'll just briefly run through what we're going to cover off in the webinar today. So we're going to cover off the trends that we're seeing in modern service management models, some of which you may already be experiencing within your own organisations. We'll then go through some of the key messages that our clients are feeding back to us, both for our own engagements with the clients, but also kind of summaries of the kind of series of interviews we do with CIOs, which some of you may have seen that we have online that ICOR do. We're then going to touch on the challenges that we've observed when working with the clients and challenges for service management as we move forward in this digital world that organisations are increasingly embracing. And coupled with that, some of the barriers that we see to being able to address some of those challenges. So again, that we've seen in different organisations. And then, having established the kind of challenges and the barriers, if you like, I'll then be handing over to my colleague Chris, who will go through. So how does IT and service management need to change? So we'll cover off some of the key areas we believe need to be looked at, and then we'll look at how we can make those changes. So if you like, putting them into practice. We have kind of recommended steps that we've used with clients to enable them to address those challenges, if you like, and get to the destination that they want to get to. We'll take a brief look at frameworks and methodologies. I'm sure you're aware there are many out there. We'd just like to share some guidance on what you should think about if you're deciding to go down that road and implement a new framework and methodology. And then finally, we'd just like to bring it together at the end in a conclusion with some key points to take away. Okay, so modern service management models. So everyone's probably at a very different stage in the way that their organizations are probably set up, but I'm expecting that quite a lot of your service models that you have in place at the moment look something similar to what you'll see on the kind of bottom left-hand side of the slide, which is quite a siloed kind of monolithic type model, probably formed and set up around kind of ITIL version 3 type design. It would have probably been put in place and designed with a view to providing kind of control and stability to a degree, with probably a limited amount of change. So, for example, weekly cabs, etc. And that will be how it was set up and put in place. But what we're seeing is that as organizations are wanting to move to this new digital world, and I've invoked, as I'm sure a lot of organizations have, and the ones that you've worked with or working with, a digital transformation program, we are and have seen clearly over the last 10 years this evolving of this agile service methodology. And in some cases, your organizations we've worked with are now even moving on to kind of a DevOps type approach as a kind of augmentation of that. And what we're seeing is that service management is now struggling to find its place and its ability to be able to flex and provide value to those organizations in terms of the way that service management has previously been organized. And essentially, we're seeing that service management now finds itself in a place where it needs to transform to see where it can fit into this new service management model and the new terms and the life cycle that is now evolving as part of this new model. And this is the biggest challenge and overall that service management needs to find out where it fits. So obviously we have our views and we've got some of our own feedback, but iCORE isn't just about that. We're very much about the interaction we have with our clients, and what we have on the screen here is just a few examples and summaries of the kind of general themes that we've got back from our clients in regards to the kind of some of the key things that they see are kind of challenges for the way that service management and IT in general needs to change. And skilling, and particularly right skilling, has been right up there in terms of the feedback that our clients are giving us. Yeah, IT and service management in particular needs to look at how the skills that it requires for this reinvention, if you like, of the way that service management needs to now function and integrate with other parts of either IT or frankly the business. So it's not just about reskilling per se, it's about making sure it's the right skills that enable it to integrate in that way. The capacity and complexity due to the amount of change that is now coming down the line with this increased velocity, the message we're getting is that is not going to change. In fact, if anything, it's going to increase exponentially as more digital transformation programs are engaged with, and that velocity is pushed harder and harder. Organizations are just going to want more and more of it. So the change is coming, and it's going to come in ever increasing volume. And so in terms of how we need to change, or IT needs to change, that comes from the CIO downwards. So the messages around the CIO needs to be operating at a different level, and particularly in terms of now that integration with the business, whereas before we probably had the luxury of IT just being able to look after IT things. It's really now business first and IT second. And that is kind of got to come from the kind of top down throughout all the functions, etc. And I think lastly, the biggest challenge, and it kind of links to this kind of IT having empathy with service management, is if we do look to make changes in the way we approach things, and potentially part of that option may be to look at new frameworks. What we must be mindful of, and the clear message has come through, that IT must be mindful that if we do put some form of best practice in to adapt to this new digital world, that it stays relevant and is seen as relevant to existing business frontline services. It can't be done in isolation. If it's just done as a new framework and that's it, it will not work, and it will not deliver the value that the business is looking for. So on to the challenges. So the first heading is irrelevance. I guess you could almost flip that over to kind of rephrase it as maintaining relevance, if you like. So we see how service management is struggling to, as kind of mentioned briefly before, maintain its previous space and responsibilities in organizations. We are seeing examples where service management is now getting consumed into other business functions, and that may be something that resonates with yourselves or not, or merged into kind of subsections of IT operations departments, and to some extent almost disappearing from view as part within the department structure, certainly at a kind of a senior, a high level. So we definitely see that as a challenge in that regard. You're now seeing kind of new terms. So I'm sure a lot of us now have been told that services are now products, and that's the way organizations are seeing it. We have new roles such as product managers who are now taking the lead, and in some cases actually becoming service managers or moving into that service manager space, if you like. And these products are frequent in number, but they are also made up of microservices and can often be very complex and difficult to understand. And the challenge here is that service management find that difficult to manage using the existing techniques, which goes back to the kind of reskilling and the evolving. Using those existing service management techniques does not work easily from what we've seen when you're dealing with a product type deployment of mini releases, incremental releases on a frequent basis through the Scrum and Sprint process. This is all providing a challenge for service management as it currently is structured. Similarly to the kind of the products and services element of this, you've got product management governance. So we're seeing governance changes now, and you may have experienced these as well, where the product management lifecycle is essentially forming a new kind of governance structure and ways of working that are emerging within organizations. So today you will quite often see, and we see it frequently, product, operations and business working very closely through the various stages of the lifecycle, from design right through to implementation. And in some cases, service management is not even necessarily seen as a component of that lifecycle. Or worse still, seemingly not to add value, or is seen as a bit of a barrier to kind of the velocity that they're trying to push through that governance. So that is a key challenge, and from an organizational and a structural point of view, that service management needs to embrace and take on board. If we look at it from a process point of view, where traditionally we've all seen service management deliver processes such as kind of incident, problem, change and release, for examples. We're now observing in quite a few organizational structures the growth of these global process owners, organizational wide process owners, who have a level of knowledge and detail now about some of those specific processes that your more traditional, say, service manager will find very hard to match, because their skill set was trained across a broad set of skills. And the outcome that we're seeing from that is that when it comes to making those improvements, it is those global process owners that are kind of instigated, because they are perceived to be more integrated with the new ways of working. We've seen things like communities of practice grow up, and they are the people that are kind of managing and maintaining those improvement activities that previously would have been the remit of the service manager. So I think another key area that we've seen, and I'm sure you're observing, but we've seen lots of challenges come through from the operational setup or the technology setup, if you like, IT ops. Now, we know and have seen that there are a huge increasing number of new tool sets when it comes to the kind of operational setup. So including things like AI ops, for example, where these tools can now monitor and predict and resolve incidents without even any kind of coordination required by service management functions. And I've seen in organizations that I've worked with previously and our clients, cloud technology and the kind of associated automation that these cloud environments now use is transforming a significant number of the previous service management functions. So it's transforming, for example, how capacity management is managed, how you configure and use configuration and asset management and how that's handled. And not least, how releases are rapidly deployed using kind of new technology methods. And previously, these practices using for these functions had a high degree of service management involvement. And we're seeing this change, significantly. So if it's not eradicating it, it's significantly reducing the need for some of these functions. And so there is a challenge here to just really evolve what some of these functions are. Some may need to kind of just be merged completely, but there is still a need to evolve some of the others because those other functions are still required. And I guess just trying to strike a more positive note, what we do see from this tooling, though, is it does offer up opportunities for service management. So we're seeing value add options go into organizations now for using some of the AI tool sets for automated request fulfillment, for example. A really good example of an organization's external customer almost having a zero touch for servant request fulfillment. And maybe the more obvious one of the more flexible channels for user engagement with IT support that again have kind of minimal or zero touch capabilities now to help self-heal or self-resolve. And I think the final point, what we're getting at here with capabilities really is just that going back to that traditional set of capabilities and functions that had service managers and service management kind of practices have kind of grown up with. These now need to evolve, and what we're seeing is that the service management teams are now looking at how they can evolve to maintain this relevance to the digital world, because there is a place there, but it needs to evolve in terms of how those skill sets are perceived, and so that integration with the business can be fully realized. Okay. And then finally, I won't go through every single one of these in masses of detail, and some of these barriers may be more or less relevant for your organizations, but it's something that we've observed in different places, different elements of this. So it's kind of summarizing some of the issues we have before we can even kind of move into the change phase, if you like, is we still see some IT departments that are perceived within their organization as just doing IT things. That's what they're viewed as. They're not seen as aligned. At times that can actually lead to avoidance and worse still, kind of a lack of trust to a degree. So that is a barrier that has to be addressed. If your organization has already proceeded down the kind of agile route, service delivery is quite often perceived as something which is quite kind of linear still, hasn't really adopted some of the new agile kind of practices. An example would be whether, during the continuous improvement process, whether there's many feedback loops, or that we've seen evidence where the service delivery doesn't really engage in that sense of it. It may have continuous improvement, but it doesn't kind of adopt that kind of continual improvement loop. I think on a more kind of personal and kind of practical level, if you like, and I certainly had this in a previous team I worked with. Service management professionals are just uneasy. They're uneasy with the new world and the new terminology that is coming into their space, if you like, this new agile kind of terminology. They feel like their space is being taken over. The approach is very different to what they've been used to and what they've been trained with. And we have to kind of address that as part of what we do in terms of making the changes that we might need to do. I also think service delivery is, and we've certainly picked up on this, is perceived, I think, by the business at times to be focused on the kind of technology and cost drivers and less on customer-driven initiatives. It's starting to change, but I think that's very much still a barrier to a large degree. And I think ultimately, as we move into this new world, the ultimate is they're fairly kind of straightforward statements, but it has the grain of truth runs through all of this, which is service management kind of needs to evolve from what was a kind of predictable, safe, possibly slightly rigid persona that the business has definitely had of service management and IT to some degree. And it kind of needs now to evolve and show it can be adaptable, it can be dynamic, and it can be focused. But above all of that, it can deliver value, because that is what the business is looking for. That's what the CEOs are looking for when they look towards their CIOs in terms of what it can deliver. And that, I think, is one of the other kind of key areas. So hopefully that's kind of not painted too much doom and gloom, but it is certainly the view that we're getting in terms of our engagements and what we're observing through our clients. So now I'd just like to hand over to my colleague, Chris, and talk a bit more about what we need to change.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Andy. And again, I just want to reiterate, thanks everyone for taking your time out in your busy schedules. Andy's obviously for the last 20 minutes or so just gone through how we see the models beginning to change and what we're hearing from a number of our clients and a number of the CIO interviews that we've been doing. What I want to do now is just slightly build on that and talk about actually how is it we need to change. If we're going to address the challenges and take along the barriers that Andy's just talked about, actually what are the key things that we need to really think about and embrace if we're going to really evolve to this new modern world that we're currently living in. Now, this won't be an exhaustive list, and it very much is dependent upon where you are in your journey. But these are frequent things that we experience when working with various clients across various industries. And some of these will not be relevant for you, but yeah, it's certainly not meant to be an exhaustive list. So I think a key thing for me, and I think the overall message is, we need to move away from our old kind of tower service-based focus and be much more focused around an end-to-end delivery chain, which embraces everything from the product management areas that Andy talked about earlier to the DevOps and the development teams, and make sure that we're kind of all working in the same direction to achieve the same aims, and that from a service perspective, we're not really seen as holding anyone back. We're seen as helping support and make sure the business moves forward at a much more rapid evolutionary pace than it has done previously. So if I just address the key points on the screen, and I'm not going to talk about them in too much detail, but the first thing is, service is fundamental, right? If we don't deliver services, we don't have a business. So we need to make sure that we are protecting that business. And we need to therefore make sure we have a clear emphasis and focus on those underpinning critical processes that support and require that kind of integrated end-to-end view. And while we may have always done that for things like incident, problem, change, etc., actually it's got to be a much wider basis now. So things like service asset and config, for instance, availability is going to become really fundamental, and we need to make sure that those sorts of things are really understood, we really have a good handle on them, and we have a really good view of how they support and underpin all those various other adjuncts, if you like, to our models that we potentially didn't address before. We also need to make sure that we view it at a risk level. So we need to make sure we understand the business risks, not just the service view of the world. And we need to make sure that we understand in detail how we can resolve and manage or even mitigate those. And certainly if you haven't thought about doing things like business continuity, or it's been a very low area of focus in terms of priorities for you previously, then that's got to change. They're making sure that we can protect the business, that the services are fundamentally minimized in terms of risk, then that becomes a key precedent for us in terms of driving that forward. We also need to start thinking about managing services rather than processes. And a number of areas have probably been doing this for a while. But actually, we need to make sure that we change the ethos within the organizations and allow things like the global process owners, as Andy talked about earlier, or even functional owners, when you look at things like service desk, to manage those individual areas. Let them get on with it and let them ensure that that's delivering to the highest possible level. And we need to evolve ourselves to manage and integrate those common services that underpin the products that we've referenced frequently through this, because products are going to become key, and we need to make sure that we understand how all of the service, all of the processes and everything else that we provide actually map into that to ensure that we have the right outcomes. So the focus has got to be more about the value we're added to the business and the outcomes, and making sure that we deliver that in the most repeatable, consistent, cheapest and most cost efficient fashion. As part of this, we're also going to start elevating some of our roles, and Andy touched upon this briefly earlier. You know, we've traditionally had service managers and we've all known what they've done, but now we're going to give them more responsibility. These people are going to kind of be managing portfolios of services that underpin and support those products. It's not just about a single little service anymore. They're going to have much more responsibility for integration, things like quality assurance, and ultimately continuous improvement, and certainly making sure that the whole delivery chain works, including our third-party suppliers. We also need to make sure we understand cost of service, and I think this has been an old debate around service management for a long time, actually. How much is it really costing you to deliver your services, and making sure that we understand that cost as part of an end-to-end product. And then understanding how that cost is then broken down. Is it CapEx, OpEx, understanding the relevant components of that. And then really looking at things like cloud services. Do you have a really good handle on your cloud services and how you procure them? Or do you understand as you grow as a business how that's going to change? And make sure that then things like you have clear uplifts and in terms of your contracts, and making sure there's clarity and transparency in the way that we grow the business, to make sure that we're not going to get absolutely hit by large costs at the back end. And once we understand the costs, obviously we need to make sure that reducing costs and increases efficiency becomes a continuous way of working across us. It becomes a continuous improvement activity, which ties into a lot of the governance type stuff that Andy talked about earlier. And if we then start to focus a little bit more about governance, and here we're talking about agile governance, I mean agile with a little a, and that's deliberate, because it's a much more about focus on quality, it's a much more focus about assurance, risk, CSI, integration, all those sorts of things that perhaps we didn't really have the right focus on previously, but they are fundamental in making sure that we have the right evolution in place and we can deliver things quicker, faster, cheaper, all the kind of mantras that we've been bandying about for some time. And certainly within your overall governance model, you need to make sure that things like product management and the overall development chain and everything else that comes with that, and the communities of practice are included and actually feed into that overall model. Training and development becomes a key factor, and Andy already touched upon this. You know, we talked about that a lot of our old service people are very comfortable in the ITIL world, but not really sure what this digital world means and how they need to change. So we need to make sure we have the right development and training in place, so people understand actually how they can support what is required by those new areas of the business, and therefore how we potentially need to change to be able to embrace them and make sure that we're not seen as the barriers and that we obstruct delivery, but actually we become key enablers and helpers in that overall moving into a much more rapid environment. And lastly, just to think about things like analysis and reporting, making sure that we have a single view of the way things are performing through a single pane of glass. We're not just talking about reports, we're not just talking about KPIs, we're talking about a different ethos in the way that we provide that level of reporting to the business, and making sure that everyone understands how things are performing from an end-to-end perspective at all times to enable us to get things to market in a much quicker fashion. So there's a lot on that slide in terms of the things that we need to change. But if we then start to talk about actually, how do we put that into practice? So we've worked with a number of clients over a period of time and developed a particular way of working that we believe is really effective. And it based it around 5 key principles. So it really boils down to, first, making sure that there is an appetite for change within the business, that people understand the value of actually embracing a much more leaner, more efficient operating model, and how all of these various different groups actually will function and work together. So making sure that there is a real demand for it, making sure that we understand the requirements, and making sure that everyone is bought into that model. Because unless you get that up front, you're probably going to fail, or certainly your life will be made much harder as you start to really evolve and agree a model and start to look to embed it. Once you kind of got that in place, then you can start to move into understand your as is and how it looks today. And then what do we need to do to align it with both the wider IT and, more importantly, the business? So make sure we understand things like the business strategy, the drivers, the overall vision. What is it we're trying to get out of this, and what is the end goal? And that really provides the overall inputs into our new operating model and the plan that we want to go. And it's important to make sure that whatever model you do addresses all of the things and the challenges and barriers that we've talked about numerous times during this webinar. So essentially what you need to do then is start to develop a model. And it's not just a one-time exercise. What you need to be doing is, as you build the model and you start to define elements of that, and you start to address some of the challenges and barriers that Andy referred to earlier, and some of the things I talked about on the previous slide, you need to be testing it frequently. You need to be able to make sure, say, does that really address that point? How does it really enable us to deliver those outcomes? And what will happen is it'll become a constant refining exercise as you start to develop and build on it. You'll start at a lower level, you'll build the next layer up, and that may mean that we have to go back down and change the base layer. And so we'll get an evolution and start to build. So we're going to get a defined model at the end that we believe addresses all of the issues and challenges that we've got and actually delivers the outcomes that we want to get to it. Once you kind of develop that plan, and obviously it's really about ensuring you have the right resources in place and the means to implement it, and make sure you understand how you're going to measure success. So it's kind of, how do we get there? So make sure you kind of define your transition plan, make sure you understand the resources you need, understand the timelines, and make sure you have a clear and efficient communication plan about what's going to happen and when. And then finally, you kind of get down to the overall executing and embedding. And clearly, you just need to make sure that you're following your plan. Any issues and risks are identified early. We feed them back through our agile governance model, and we're constantly making sure they get addressed. And if necessary, going back to step 3 and refining your model again, because it's very unlikely you'll get it right first time. And even in some cases, it may be a case of, let's go for a minimal viable product and get that working, and then we'll continually evolve. It really does depend upon the journey that you want to go through and how quickly you want to actually do that evolution. But the key point is, even when you get to the end point, no matter whether or not you're going full blown or whether you want to do it in incremental steps, you've got to make sure that you have the measures in place. You've got to make sure that you have understanding, clarity about what your outputs are meant to be. And then you look to kind of refine and go through the usual continuous improvement chain that we all know from a service management perspective. So this is a standard framework that we've used across many others, many across our clients, and we've proved it to be successful. We've implemented new operating models across a number of our clients, and we would recommend that kind of structure to ensure that you have clarity about the journey, you have clarity around timescales, and therefore you can get what you need to at the end of it. Lastly, I just want to touch upon frameworks and methodologies. So there's a lot of frameworks and methodologies out there, and we all know what they are. I'm sure we all have our different views on them, but they all claim that you need to adopt their particular framework or methodology to ensure that you kind of evolving towards these new, more agile ways of working. But the key thing from our perspective is, yeah, a framework is great, and they do help in terms of just enable us to ensure that we're structured in the right way to some level. But actually, it's got to be aligned with your organizations and goals and objectives, and therefore it needs to make sure that you can implement that without any major disruption. So you need to be put a lot of thought into which framework or methodology is right for you as a business. And there are some key things that you need to think about every time you start to consider frameworks and methodologies, really. I mean, most of these frameworks are fairly complex. They absolutely need you to understand at a fairly detailed level all the relevant components of it. And actually, you have to start to ask yourself do you need all of those elements? Because actually, if you implemented that in its entirety, it will take you a very long time, no doubt. It'll be very complex. You'll need a lot more people, and therefore it will result in that kind of long time and high cost to resource and implement, and your return on investment will take much longer. So make sure that you only take the frameworks that one align with your business and align with the culture of your business. Two, are not a major disruption to the way you're working today. And three, really enable it that you can pick the right components from it rather than having to adopt all of the necessary elements of it. The second point around is that they can be very expensive in terms of training certification, getting people who really understand a lot of these frameworks and making sure they maintain current and that they can evolve as you go with them can be quite a difficult journey for people, and it can take quite a time to get the right people in who have the right expertise and knowledge, and they can be very expensive people. So make sure you're just thinking about that and you get the kind of right level in terms of managing the overall complexity with the requirements for understanding within your resources and the amount of training they'll need in order to get that. The other thing is a lot of these are kind of targeted at large enterprises, and most of clients, or a lot of clients we work with, aren't large enterprises. They're reasonably sized for organizations, absolutely. But they're not really ready to embrace all of the relevant components. So as I've talked about it previously, really, just think about those components and what will make work for you as a business to achieve your overall outcomes. Even, as I said before, start at a minimal viable product and look to evolve from there. And a lot of these frameworks talk about actually they're there to improve agility. And I think some of them, absolutely, some of them are beginning to really prove that and actually outline how they can assist. I think for others, I think they're still to be actually reconvinced. And I think you just need to think about the overall framework, the overall approach and methodology and say, does that really enable us to work in a more agile way? And therefore choose the right one that's kind of aligned with that, depending upon where you are in your journey in that sort of space. I think from an ICOR perspective, we don't recommend or endorse any particular framework. We're happy to work with all of them, and we have experience across the broad range. But we like to use a kind of light service integration and management (SIME) approach. Because we believe that is flexible in the way that it works and enables us to build a much more effective modern service management approach. And in our opinion, that really does work, but it really much does depend upon the client. Now, we have delivered a previous webinars around agile SIAM and how that can work for you. and we are more than happy to provide the link if you're interested. So I'm just wary of the time now, so we're getting towards the back end. So just to really summarize and bring a lot of the things that we talked about today. Obviously, businesses are moving much more quickly than ever before. They really need to get things to market quicker. They need to evolve to maintain the kind of competitive edge that they've got, and they won't allow IT to slow the pace. That whole landscape is now changing, and us as service management needs to change with it. We need to embrace those terms. We need to make sure we understand how we're going to cooperate and work with all these other areas and these new ideas that perhaps we hadn't really thought about previously. The CIOs and heads of service management make sure we need to understand the wider business challenges, the overall priorities, and actually how we and where we fit in the overall service value chain, to make sure that we ensure that we're seen as enablers and helpers rather than barriers. There are a number of frameworks and methodologies out there. I've touched upon those just now. All have great intentions and all provide levels of capability and knowledge. It is important, though, to make sure that any investment needs to provide that increase in efficiency, agility, and quality, and we need to get those realised promptly to ensure that we maximise our return on investment. From an ICOR perspective, we've helped a number of our clients develop their operating models over the last few years, and we've embedded a number as well to help them drive a much more efficient and more cost-reduced way of working. It really does depend upon the journey. So if you are struggling with any of the kind of the operating model or ways of working or trying to embed it, I think our message to you will always be, keep it simple. Go with something that's relatively light and then look to further evolve. Do not try and eat the whole elephant in one go. However, you know, if you are struggling and do need help, then we're here to help you. And I think the key message, right? So as we know, nothing is more inevitable than change. And certainly for service management, currently more than ever, the danger is, unless we continue to evolve, unless we align ourselves with these new goals, actually the danger is we could get eliminated from the race. I want to say thank you for your time today. You've had about 40 odd minutes of free airtime. So this, I promise you, this is the only selling slide you're going to get today. So from an ICOR perspective, we talked quite a lot about operating models today, but you also may be aware of the other kind of products that we offer and can help with. So there's the agile service management approach that we've touched upon a lot today. That can either be aligned with the operating model or separate activity, just to focus on how we integrate those kind of agile, DevOps, CI/CD, all those other things into a coherent way forward. We do a lot around service design and transition optimization. We've done a number of webinars and sessions and helped a number of organizations with their SIAM model and looking at ways of working with their various third parties and outsourcing. We also do a lot around vendor and multi-supplier management and how they should be integrated in delivery chain, and helped a number of organizations select and go out to tender for their suppliers. And lastly, we obviously do quite a bit around service desk and support modernization. And for all of those areas, it can be anything from a simple assessment or guidance through to developing a much more detailed roadmap for change or designing new ways of working. Or we could just be providing hands-on SME support because you're struggling to either get the right people or your people do not have the time and to really focus on some areas that really are going to make a difference. So if you have any challenges in those space, looking for some help, then please do reach out to us. We're more than happy to assist. With that, I'm just going to hand back to Naeem just to wrap up.
Thanks for that, Chris. Just to let everyone know, again, we'll send out a recording of today's webinar to all attendees. We also will be doing 30-minute one-to-one follow-up session to discuss your specific situation challenges, so please do get in touch. And lastly, just look out for our next webinar, which will be later this year. So I'd just like to say thank you for taking the time out today, and we hope to see you again very soon.